You've obviously spent about 15 years focused on student housing. What motivated that decision?
I thought that I can bring my skill set to this environment and do something better.
How did you then scale?
We had a very young, enthusiastic team.
Do you think that brand is really important in student housing?
I think a strong brand conveys a degree of trust. I think is hugely important.
What motivated you to contribute to the co-living sector?
All of us had always believed that what we were providing shouldn't just be for students.
A lot of investors say co-living is unproven. What would your response be to those naysayers?
I'm quite happy for them to be naysayers.
Is there anything you would have done differently if you could start all over again?
Believe in your ability to deliver and keep it in-house. If you get it right, it will open doors for you.
Reinventing Real Estate podcast is all about speaking to and engaging with some of the game changers in the student housing, co-living and broader markets, and getting their insights as to where the future of our industries lie, what they're seeing right now and how they got there. This episode is one of the key reasons why we launched this Reinventing Real Estate podcast. It's to interview guests who are truly transformative and provide huge amounts of insight and have changed the market immeasurably and changed the landscape for student housing, co-living or other uses. And therefore our guest for this podcast is Adam Brockley, one of the founders and key innovators over at the household name Scape. And Adam brings a wealth of experience from operations, from development, from construction, all the way up to brand building. And we are so lucky to have him on board.
This is episode 4 of Reinventing Real Estate, and we are really excited to have Adam Brockley here, not only because of his enormous impact on the student housing sector, but also getting an insight into an entrepreneur's view into starting their own business, growing their own business, and really making it the household name it is today. So we're really honoured to have you, Adam, and we're very excited to delve into everything from where you started, your personal kind of growth during this journey, the student housing market in general, and also getting on to your new exciting co-living launch. So I think it'd be great to start at the very beginning and really go back to that moment where you thought up Scape. And obviously 2008 was a very challenging time, possibly a time where not many businesses were being founded given the crisis that was going on. But would love to hear from your perspective what motivated you to found Scape.
Well, what an introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to that. So I'll do my best. And you're absolutely right about the timing of 2008. So Scape was set up by myself and 3 co-founders. We were introduced via a bank in 2006, got on extremely well, and decided that we would throw our hat in the ring together to bring forward what we thought was going to be a fantastic opportunity. But it was conceived in 2006 when the world was still quite a rosy place. And the genesis for it was that I had come from a residential development background, and it had become quite obvious to me that there were a number of people that would do things at an okay standard, and then there were those that would go that much further, and by putting in that much extra effort would create something that would stand out from the crowd. Student housing was very, very little known at that point, and it was only because of a number of contacts within the industry generally that I became aware of it. And in becoming aware of it, I obviously did some research into it, and I found that there wasn't a huge offering for the consumers at that time. And so perhaps a little bit conceitedly, I thought that actually, I think I can bring my skill set to this environment and do something better and introduce more opportunities and more excitement to the product. Because, forgive me for saying this, but at the time it was a fairly pedestrian product and a very vanilla offering that there wasn't a great deal of creativity involved in. I'm sure some people that were, in fact, there were very few people operating it at the time. There were a couple of the big players, which I'm sure you guys are aware of. And I think because of that position, i.e. they were unchallenged, they probably didn't have to do that much to excel. But well, we looked at it and went, this looks like a pretty compromised offering. And to us, being a student shouldn't mean making compromises. So that's where it started. One of the key influences, problems, challenges that has been throughout my career in this space is planning. And that is one of the key reasons why we found ourselves just about ready to get going with a very significant scheme for the time. It was a 588-bed student scheme right opposite Queen Mary. And we were full of optimism and hope and dreams. And then the world fell apart. So I think it's something that you will no doubt be wanting to know about, a challenge that has been overcome. That was definitely one of the most significant of those. So managing to keep the wheels on in a market that was not dissimilar to it is now, in banks running for cover, a great deal of uncertainty, lack of confidence, and to get from having obtained a consent and thinking that was it, everything was going to be rosy and dandy, to basically the door was shut and you were going to have to push water uphill to get this over the line, was where we found ourselves. But I'm delighted to say we did. We managed to keep that ball rolling up that mountain. And after a reasonably challenging construction period, we opened the building in time for the 2012 Olympic Games, which gave us a sort of soft opening and also gave us an insight into where the co-living will come from. But I'll come on to that.
And in that moment where you thought this might not be possible, was there a moment of doubt? Did you think to yourself, we can walk away at this point? Or was it always to continue?
So I think the failure is not an option maxim had to prevail there, because it was without doubt the biggest deal that we'd ever done. And to say that everything was on the line is an understatement. And I had some very frank and nervous conversations with my wife about how she was going to be living in a tent in some rural park somewhere. But I have always been quite a persistent fellow. And when people tell me things can't get done, I tend to find ways of doing them. Did I know full well at that time that was going to be the case? No. And there were some very dark times. It required a lot of hard work, a lot of persistence, and I'm fairly sure a reasonable amount of wine as well.
And you've got a lovely tent there anyway.
Yes. Another huge undertaking, which I probably got a little bit exceeding my grasp, but yes, got there in the end.
I think the question that I would love to ask Adam is why student housing? I mean, admittedly, you talk a bit about the opportunity in the market at that point and the fact that there was very limited offerings, and especially around this customer-centric student housing with a bit more creativity. But to really focus 100% of your time on student housing, what was the kind of key driver? Did you just look at the market across the board and think, like, wow, this is something that's completely untapped, or was it something that was a bit more organic than that?
No, it is pretty much, I think it's, when you've been doing something in a space, it's always nice to find something that's slightly different to do, because after a while in the residential space, I felt it was time for a new challenge, and the opportunity that student created in the fact that it was basically a very much a nascent sector, certainly in the guise that it's turned into now. I think it was much more focused, even though it was private provision, it was much more focused around the sort of on-campus type provision. So to have the opportunity to enter into a new undefined market and do your best to put your mark on it, I think was a very exciting opportunity, and clearly one of the reasons that was the route that was taken. Clearly there is a commercial side to that, which is if it's a new market, then surely there are opportunities. And as I'm sure you're aware, when generally in a new market, there are richer pickings for early adopters, as long as they get it right.
Absolutely. And how do you think your kind of day one vision of Scape has evolved over the years?
Significantly. So I think the underlying ethos hasn't changed at all. The underlying ethos was these aren't customer, they're not just people that you sell to, they're your consumers. So I think that the nature of the relationship between us as providers and the students, we wanted it to be very much a customer-centric experience, and that hasn't changed. We've always tried to inject a fun working environment for the people that are involved in the business, and I think we can safely say we're still delivering on that. The early days, it was clearly a leaner ship with people doing a lot more varied roles and everyone chucking their hat into all sorts of fields and doing their best. Whereas now we're a much more specialized business. We have got an unbelievably professional team with great specialisms across all those areas that you need in order to deliver a great product. But the scale of it, as you rightly pointed out, has gone through the roof, and the requirements and obligations in order to deliver a business like that mean you have to mature and develop in-house expertise that that you certainly didn't have available to you when you first set up.
And was this always the goal, to get to this size, this scale, or was that something when you started was never really predicted, I suppose?
No, there was always an aspiration to become an industry leader. The fact that we ended up in Australia quite so quickly was perhaps a little bit of a surprise, but has been an unbelievable journey. And we continue to want to expand the existing business from where we are now. So it was never, oh, we'll do one and see where we go from there. It was always, if we're going into this, we're going into it with a plan. Has that plan, have we exceeded where I thought we would be? Yes. Are we stopping where we're at now? No. I think there's definitely there's a real desire to carry on growing the business, both in this space and in the living sector generally.
I think, Adam, as well, what's really interesting, and obviously I wasn't around at the time when it all started at Scape, but from what I hear, and obviously to some extent even today, a lot of the operators are still treating students as tenants and people that they sell to, and clearly you came about the market in a very different mode, and I think the market's really followed. And I think the hospitality side of the student housing market and being influenced by the softer skills of how you speak to students, how you engage them with events and community, how they come together through different activities and meet people and utilize the facilities, I suppose, in a sort of enhanced hotel style way. Would love to hear a bit more about how that all evolved at Scape and why you felt like that was quite important from the offset. And then obviously we've seen a lot of brands follow in the same footsteps of where you've led.
Yeah, so weirdly enough, I think it came out from a very early interaction. So obviously, when you're a new business, you're very keen to ensure that you are resonating with your consumers. And from day one, we were always trying to make sure, and bear in mind that from day one, there's been a high level of overseas students staying with us. So that gives us, I think, an even higher level of pastoral care requirements, because we were very mindful that when we first started marketing the business, we were marketing probably to two sectors or to two groups. One was those people who come and live with us, and the other was their parents, who were obviously very concerned that their pride and joy were starting a new life in a new country and expected a level of security, a level of support that I don't think was necessarily there. So we kicked off with that from day one. We're trying to imprint it, the desire to interact really well with all the people in the building across the business. So one of the things that I liked most was that in the early days, we used to get a real good feedback from the cleaners, because the cleaners were great people. They were all employed directly. It wasn't a third-party business. And we've always had like strong team leaders, and those team leaders imprinted the values that we wanted down through their customer, through their business lines. And then we'd get feedback from the cleaners going, oh, these people are having a great time. These people are concerned about this. Oh, this person might have a slight issue. So it was very much a ground up approach to it. And then obviously, as the business has matured, we've had greater resources to expend on in those various areas, and we continue to work on it. So we're constantly looking at ways in which we can expand experiences for the occupiers, taking them away to various places, that sort of thing. So I think you're on the money with the hospitality offering. I think, and as the general sector has matured, and it's very kind of you to say that others have taken to our line, but I think you're right. And I think as a result of that, the level of expectation amongst residents rises, because it is being done better generally. So there's a little bit of it improves across, and then it's like, how do you continue to improve that?
I'd like to hone in on, I suppose, this period of time where you decided. Sorry.
I'm trying to forget those 2008 days.
Sorry, giving you a bit of PTSD here. Where you decided to take Scape private again after it was publicly traded. What kind of motivated that decision?
It was two very, very fundamental things. Firstly, we had the opportunity to do so. And secondly, it puts us back in complete control of our destiny. And I alluded to the fact that we employed everyone ourselves in the early days in the business. And that was a hugely important thing for us. That we did, at one point, we dabbled with a third-party FM company to provide various services within the building. And whilst they were a great company, that company had their own goal, which was to make a profit. Whereas our goal for facilities management within the buildings is to deliver the best service possible within the building. And obviously, we have to do it at an economical level, but we're taking out somebody else's profit, and therefore we can throw that back in. It's the same thing with taking the business private. We just wanted to be fully in control of our destiny again, because there are, when you have third-party stakeholders that are removed, then
yeah, absolutely. So those were the key reasons why you wanted to bring it back into the private realm. And do you think it would be where it was today if it hadn't taken that trajectory?
Well, that's I think that's an interesting one. I mean, with the general level of uncertainty out there, third-party stakeholders may not hold the line as much as people who are fully invested in the business. So I can't say for sure, but I feel a lot more comfortable where we are than being reliant on third parties.
And then in terms of going back again, I would love to... Look, this is a nice point. This is a positive point. I would like to know what it was like being in your kind of first offices as a startup. What was that, the ideation phase with you and your co-founders? What did a normal day look like?
I think what we always like to ask Adam is take us to the room, take us to where it all started and that feeling of being together. And then obviously everyone knows where Scape is now and all the success that you've got now, but it's always nice to understand where it all came from.
We, as a group of founders, were incredibly lucky in that we were very diverse. So I'm pretty much the grubby bricks and land guy. Then there's an incredibly clever guy who understands the numbers. And then there's a chap who just sprinkles a little bit of magic onto it all. And we would just spark off of each other, and down to things like we'd constantly do prototypes of rooms. So we'd change the size of a wardrobe, we'd change the size of a color. I remember one comparatively recently where this is for the other business, and there's 3 of us in this room humping around precast box sizes for the bathroom pod and the bed and what have you. And one of the contractors behind me going, do you know how much value there is in that room humping around boxes? So we still do it today. So there was a huge amount of energy, a huge amount of determination. I mean, as I alluded to, there are always problems in a business of any business, but planning has always been a key one, because you do your best to plot and scheme for things, and then they do their best to subvert that course of action. But no, so a typical day they were long days. I think 14, 16-hour days were not uncommon, and dealing with issues that we hadn't dealt with before, because now we're substantially more experienced. Chances are we've come across the majority of the circumstances that you would expect to come across within the business, whereas back then it was a new problem would arise that nobody had ever faced before, and we had to work out how to get around it. So I'm delighted to say we've managed to get around most of them. In fact, I don't think we've had any derail us so far. So yeah, but it was a lot of fun. We've had a lot of good people stay with us all the way through. We've had a lot of good people leave and go on to do other things and be very successful in that. So yeah, I think it was a great melting pot.
So you think the key was that kind of balance, I suppose, the different skill sets and being able to bounce and balance ideas.
The thing is, despite having different skill sets, we all had the same positive approach to things, as in, we will get this done.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were days where it's like, oh my goodness, we cannot work out how we're going to get it done. But you go home that night and come back probably 3 or 4 hours later, dust yourself off and get on with it again. So yeah, and I think having the strength of the team around us has been very important in that.
And then once you got that first operational scheme, how did you then scale from that point?
Well, that is a very interesting one, because that's where we dabble. For example, that's where we dabbled with the third-party facilities management, but we found out very quickly that wasn't for us. So we had a very young, very enthusiastic team. Myself and co-founders were very hands-on, fulfilling a number of the roles, attending all the meetings in all the spaces and what have you. And it becomes very apparent very quickly that you cannot do all the things all the time, and you'll need to have a very good team around you to whom you can pass on responsibility and know that it's going to be dealt with. And unfortunately, it takes a while to get to that level. So you can't just hire somebody. I mean, chances are anyone that's decent that you need to hire is probably on 6 months' notice anyway. And then once they're in, you need probably 6 months to make sure they're bedded in. So it did take a while to develop that. And there was a lot of people wearing different hats for quite some time. But yeah, that's how it went. And now we're basically an institutionally acceptable management structure. So it's been quite a journey from 4 of us and probably 5 or 6 people running around a building to where we are now.
And then we have, sorry, I forgot to say actually at the beginning, but we have a segment called 2 Truths, 1 Lie, which basically I'll read out 3 statements. I'm the only one that knows the lie, and we debate what we think the lie is. So the first statement is, strong brands can charge up to 20% more for products and services. The second statement is it takes 20 impressions for a consumer to remember a new brand name. And the third statement is P&G spent the most of all on branding and promotions, which was 8.1 billion in 2021.
That feels pretty high though, doesn't it, Adam? That last statement. I don't know if you feel that.
Yeah, but they are a huge
They are
business,
a massive
aren't they?
business, yeah.
I mean, personally, I'm going to go with number 2 being the wrong one.
The one
The
where
lie.
it says it takes 20 impressions for a consumer to remember a new brand.
I think it's less. Yeah, I think a strong new brand will be absorbed by consumers a lot quicker than that.
Well, I can reveal to you, you got that spot on. And it is 7 to 8 impressions that it takes.
Wow. Gosh.
It's actually quite a impressive number if you think you see a brand name 7 times and at that point you're recognizable.
I suppose it's the power of marketing, isn't it, Adam?
Indeed.
So that
Yeah.
leads us nicely onto our kind of marketing and branding section. And I suppose this is a kind of a different type of question, but interesting to hear how opportunities come to you and how you look at opportunities. So when you get the marketing material from agents surrounding an opportunity, what do you think really works to grab your interest?
I have to say, I was talking to Jamie the other day about a particular opportunity he put across my desk, and I had to say that he put together a very, very good document. So it does count. To me, it does count how well the information is presented. You can't make something that is fundamentally undesirable desirable even by wrapping it in great wrapping paper.
Yeah.
But you can certainly differentiate you can certainly differentiate two offerings quite distinctly by a greater effort in the way the information is presented, the image quality, the way the information is presented in terms of succinctness, that sort of thing. So, there are a number of agents who present stuff like it's on the back of a fish and chip wrapper, and you've got to have your head on to actually even want to engage with it. So yes, it's very important. The funny thing is actually quite often I do pay quite a bit of attention to those fish and chip wrappers, because generally they come from the more seasoned fellows who may not fully appreciate what they've got. So it's always worth having a look at it, as opposed to somebody like Jamie who'll understand the ins and outs of everything.
When we're looking at things, as you say, Adam, and looking at the hospitality element and the B2C element that the likes of you guys and some others in the market do so well, I think it's always a bit confusing to us as to why that isn't translated into the B2B marketplace, because ultimately we're all human beings and we all respond on a day-to-day basis to being marketed at, whether it's product or services or social media or anything else in between. So it definitely fascinates us as to how that lands with investors and developers, of which you're both of that. So I think that kind of really leads us on to the question about kind of brand identity and marketing within student housing, because people often have the thought process that students only live in student housing for 2 years, maximum 3 years, and therefore the power of the brand really isn't as important as the likes of hotels, where you have repeat visits and you can maybe go to another hotel in a different area. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think that brand is really important in student housing, or do you think it's mainly there for kind of show or for investors?
No, I think it's hugely important, because notwithstanding the fact that, as you say, a student, and we'll come. There is an extension to this which we'll come on to, but notwithstanding the fact that the student may stay there for 3 years only. There's an acquisition phase ahead of that, and there's a general awareness within the market. So where you've got parents with different age siblings, where you've got people who are starting to look at, there will be people in Australia or China or India that are thinking about their education already now, and they'll be surfing the web, looking at things, and quite a few of them will be going into the detail of looking at accommodation and clicking into websites. If you don't have a strong brand that resonates well, then you're making life harder for yourself. And also, I think a strong brand conveys a degree of trust that when you're making such an important decision as where you're going to live for the next year, anything from a year to 3 years, I think is hugely important. Plus, it also gives you an opportunity to showcase your product, and it to showcase your business's style.
And do you think that's differed from your perspective between when you started and in 2012 it was more of a millennial consumer who was staying in the student buildings versus now you've got the Gen Z market who have a very different ethos and have grown up with social media? I mean, how are you seeing that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely the case that the digital acquisitions and everything is significantly more important, but I wouldn't underestimate even the millennials. Millennials were pretty tech savvy, and the importance of a strong web presence, and not, I mean, we've improved and developed it significantly from then, but it was important then, and I think it's going to be of increasing importance going forward. But, and just linking a point through, which is going to slightly throw you out, for us as well, with our aspirations to expand our presence within the living sector in general, I think it's really important to have a brand that can be trusted and from which we can build future strands too.
And for you, what is the kind of future of brand and marketing in this environment that we find ourselves in? As in, we've gone through a huge amount of change. We've got artificial intelligence on the horizon. We've got content-rich media. We've got all sorts of written communications and PR and everything in between. Like, what do you think is the future of Scape within the brand and marketing world?
So I entirely agree with what you're saying about, and we are already using AI within our marketing efforts. But one of the key things for me has always been about integrity and deliverability. So quite often over the course of the years, we've been to various marketing pitches by new agencies or what have you, and they've come up with something that sounds all bells and whistles, but there's too much hyperbole for me. No way do I want to I don't want to not say how good that what I genuinely believe we are, but I want us to then deliver credibly on what we say. It's no good saying that you can come to Scape and you'll leave as the Prime Minister of your chosen country, because that's just simply not credible and not deliverable. But and for me, that's important going forward. I firmly believe great marketing is important, because great marketing shows you believe in your product, and if you believe in your product, then surely your consumer is going to have a great time there. So if you can't be bothered to do good marketing, then I think that says something a bit odd about you. But for me, and it's what I bang the drum about it at all the meetings, is great, that's fantastic. Can we deliver on it, and can we be shown to be delivering it?
So, I mean, the student housing market at the moment is obviously quite fascinating. And I think from our perspective, we see all the macroeconomic volatility, we see debt costs rising, as you said, and some uncertainty on the horizon. But when we speak to investors, it's never a question of will you invest in student housing. It's always a question of we've got the liquidity and when we're going to deploy into the sector, because it's so counter-cyclical and so interesting. And actually, we're seeing structural changes in the office sector whereby a lot of the funds that we know from other aspects of the market are now meaningfully looking at student housing. But it would be lovely to hear from you as to how you see it and how you think it's likely to evolve over the next kind of, I suppose, few months and years ahead.
I don't think the student market's going, well, I don't think it's going to get any less desirable. And the interesting thing for me is everyone's always said it's counter-cyclical. But with the exception of the pandemic, even in good times, we've had 100% full buildings. So I think if you are, in terms of the sort of the demographics of it, I think we're now talking about 1 million students by 2030. So, and that's going to continue to mean that there's a shortfall of accommodation within the sector generally. So certainly within the next 20 years, I don't see there being any reduction in demand for the services that we provide, because people have always got an aspiration for education. Yes, there are alternative methods of education, such as apprenticeships that are being talked about and what have you. But there's nothing to say that those apprenticeships won't necessarily be taught out of higher education campuses or what have you, and then still feed through to the demand. So I think a maturing economy naturally gets better educated. And as a result of that, we will continue to see the demand for higher education.
And from an investor perspective, do you think the market continues to evolve, mature, become more prominent as new investors, new private equity funds, new overseas sovereign wealth funds kind of enter the marketplace? And then I suppose the second question to that is, well, what does that mean for yields and what does that mean for the general appetite?
We're getting very insightful there, aren't we? So the first one I think you can just cover off, and it's like go back even 6 years. It was still being referred to as alternative sector. It's clearly not alternative anymore. The weight of the funds that are going into it is significant, that it's a mainstream source. I think if you're an investment manager, you'd like to have a spread across your portfolio and to have something that's regarded as defensive as student that actually happens to outperform anyway. Why wouldn't you do? Quite what that weighting is, that's for individual fund managers to allocate. But certainly everyone that I'm talking to says that there is plenty of space for additional funds within the sector. I suppose the important thing is to make sure that those funds find the right home and don't end up with less credible sponsors, shall we say.
And looking at the global marketplaces that you find yourself in, so I mean, obviously you've got a growing presence now in the US, where you've got some quite ambitious goals for expansion and have been involved in the Australian market for quite some time, as you mentioned. So I think what would be really interesting is to understand a bit more about not only your ambitions for the future and what you're going to be doing overseas, but how the UK market is influencing those markets and vice versa, how we can learn from the likes of the US and Australia and other jurisdictions. Because I think a lot of the activity that we have in the UK can be quite inward looking, and I think it's always useful for us to understand a bit more about what else is happening in the world.
So it was interesting for us in that when we first started thinking about international expansion, it was, so what are the drivers? What's the thing? So the drivers are, where do our consumers want to be? So as I say, a significant percentage of the consumers come from overseas, and they tend to be looking at one of three locations, which is Australia, the UK, and the US. So that was the rationale for us in selecting those places as the areas we wanted to expand in. The Australian market was very interesting in that it was probably where the UK market was as recently as probably 7 or 8 years ago, as where the UK market was 20 years ago. So it was quite interesting to see, although I would say that it's probably even more internationally student dominated than the UK market. I think that's given its proximity to the various feeding countries in terms of that. So the US is a slightly different kettle of fish for us insofar as we are doing a hybrid model there, which is closer to the co-living model than it is to the student. So we are picking up students through young graduates and the demographic that you'd expect to see in the co-living space over here. So it's not quite this. I can't comment in quite the same way on a PBSA specific sector in the US, but interestingly enough, when we first started talking about going to the US, everyone said to us, "Don't do it because it's very well catered for in its current manner." But once we started exploring over there, and it was only after we'd done our initial research, because it was originally with a view to doing PBSA, that we decided to pivot it slightly. But I think there's plenty of scope for further what we call PBSA expansion in the US, because they tend to do more of the on-campus stuff. It's privately run and what have you, but it's very on-campus and it doesn't really cater to the urban environments in the way that perhaps we do here.
Great. And now we have got our other two truths, one lie. So this one is more about the kind of focusing on the hospitality space. So the first statement is Ritz-Carlton employees can spend up to $2,000 per incident, as opposed to per year, to rescue a guest experience. The second statement is Ritz-Carlton employees are required to complete at least 250 hours of training each year. And the third and final statement is Ritz-Carlton can fire its employees immediately after a single strike.
So I'm going to go with, if they spend 250 hours training them each year, they're not going to fire them after one strike.
That is very knowledgeable thought process there.
So as long as 2 isn't a lie, then I'm going with 3 is the lie.
You are correct again. It is the lie.
There we go.
But it just shows you the investment that these brands have in terms of customer experience, that if someone has got a bad experience, spend up to $2,000 in order to make them leave happy. And then that idea of investing into the employees themselves, 250 hours of training a year to make sure that the experience is top notch, which I think we could borrow some of that in the student space, in the co-living space, in terms of delivering an experience that people will remember.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a significant in-house training program that is both digital, so people complete it online. It's like a CPD type thing. So, and with face-to-face with mentors and what have you. So I couldn't give you an exact figure of whether it's 250 hours or not, and I suspect it isn't, but it is a significant element. And we regularly have like away days where people go away and are topped up on various elements of training, be it the obvious ones of medical and how to deal with that, to just how to deliver a great experience and what to do if things go wrong. So, yeah, I mean, I think to carry on differentiating yourself, you are going to have to deliver an experience that people go and say, yeah, that's great. And I've seen some of so we rely very heavily on our residence managers. They're very important people in the business. Some of the notes that I've seen from students to the residence managers are really touching. Things like, thank you, you have made my year here so important. And they leave them gifts and what have you. I'm not saying it's all that way. There are always issues with, you can't please all the people all of the time. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to deal with those people with mental health issues who may not necessarily fit in. But that's not to say that you still can't try and do your best for those as well. So, yeah, no, I really believe in the continued development of the customer experience.
I think on the back of that, I think it's really interesting to understand for people who are watching this, really what is the future vision of the Scape brand, the Scape business, the global viewpoint that obviously you're looking at. And I know that having looked at some of the information, you want to build up 20,000 beds in the US and you've got big plans globally, but I'd love to hear a bit more about how that will evolve and a bit more view on the strategic direction of Scape moving forward into the future.
So this starts to get a little bit linked into the emerging brand. So you're probably slightly jumping ahead, but clearly it's, so we as the founders of the business are passionately involved with it all across the board, but you can't effectively administer a business across 3 continents and get some sleep. So it's very important that you have hugely good local teams. And for us, so for example, we've got a small asset in Dublin, which is brilliant. And we've got a great team there on the ground, which is literally led by the residence manager. Obviously, we provide all the sales support and marketing support and what have you, but we rely heavily on those guys there to carry out the level. Just to be honest, just dealing with business between the east and the west coast of the US is challenging because, again, there's a time difference, there's traveling backwards and forwards. So we will have to develop the regional hub management structures in order to effectively roll that out. That doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that we're going to take our hands off the wheel in any stretch. But yeah, we will, in order to deliver on that sort of aspiration, we are going to have to expand our business yet again.
Brilliant. And that does lead on perfectly to the co-living element. Really interesting that you've obviously spent about 15 years focused on student housing sector, and amongst the emergence of other popular living sectors like BTR, senior living. But it's taken co-living, I suppose, to turn your glance for a moment away from PBSA. And I would love to hear what motivated you to do that and what you've identified, much like I suppose you did all those years ago with student. What are the key elements or players that contribute to the co-living sector that you think this is our next step?
So I'll go back to where we started. So when we opened the first building in 2012, and because we opened early to cater to the Olympic Games, and we had various members of the Olympic organising committee staying there and what have you, and everyone said to us, "Wow, this is great. Can we stay in this on our own, not being a student?" And we were like, "Well, I'm afraid you can't, actually. You have to be a member of full-time." Apart from that dispensation around the Olympic Games, that no, you can't. But it was planted the seed. And I think the problem with it all is we were very much focused on growing the student business. But for example, in Australia, where the planning laws were slightly more permissive, we opened some co-living in Melbourne as well, which did well. And then, so that sort of, because we'd got a bit of a head of steam up and we knew that we had some bandwidth to explore some other opportunities, I think all of us had always believed that what we were providing shouldn't just be for students, slightly tweaked and what have you, but that we could bring it to a different audience. Now, as I keep going on about, planning is probably the biggest single impediment to anything being delivered. So bizarrely, the first one was in Guildford. We went along and said, "Oh yeah, can we have this student housing scheme?" And they said, "Well, we'd like to see some residential on it as well." So we explored an opportunity, which they said, "Well, that's not really enough bed numbers. We want to be seen to be delivering more bed numbers." So I somewhat tongue-in-cheek said to them, "Have you heard of a thing called co-living?" And they literally reached across the table and grabbed me by the arms and said, "We love it. Yes, bring it forward." So that was the genesis of actually getting the operational asset up and running on the ground. As to why we wanted to do it, I think I've touched on it we genuinely believe there's a huge demand for it. It's not the silver bullet solution to the housing crisis, but there are so many. And one of the things that I have encountered with planners when talking about this on a number of occasions is they go, yeah, but this is just not the right standard residential, is it? I said, no, it's not that. It's not substandard residential. It's premium quality house sharing, because it's not specifically focused on the. Obviously, you can fulfill a residential role in it, but I think the key target for it is, well, we've done an enormous amount of research into it, but before we decided to press the button on there, and we identified 5 different user groups. A key element of that is those people who would be in shared houses. And I think the pandemic's further exacerbated or accelerated that move, because I think a lot more and more people are going to be wanting to work from home. And as you probably saw over the pandemic, you'd have people in small bedrooms doing Zoom calls off their laptops because there's 4 of them sharing one living room, and you can't do that. Whereas the co-living product that we're bringing forward, which we don't refer to as co-living, by the way, we use the term living for some reason, and that's going to allow people to have the best touch points from a quality product, which they wouldn't otherwise have access to. And I think for that sector of the market that wants that, it's going to be a huge demand demographic. So there's a strong, compelling business reason for us, and there's a desire just from the early roots of the business.
So I think, Adam, what's really interesting about investors at the moment in co-living, and we really believe in co-living because clearly it's a marketplace where you can have young professionals, corporate travellers, or slightly older individuals as well, all share some form of blended studio-led accommodation with amenity spaces that frankly chimes in with, I think, the modern way of living. But a lot of investors come back and say, well, co-living is unproven. We've never seen how it's going to expand in the UK. With the demise of the collective and everything that went on around that, we're incredibly nervous around that. I suppose, what would your response be to those naysayers in co-living, and why are you so resolute about its success here in the UK?
So I think taking the easy one first, the collective demise wasn't anything about the operational model. It was about the way it was funded. I'd simply taken on too much debt at the time. I mean, it's a little analogy. I think they had 700 operational beds in London and 350 full-time staff. We had 6,000 beds and 160 full-time staff. So I think that the demise of that was simply the way it was funded, and got caught between the 2 blades of the pandemic and rising debt costs. The fundamental underlying product, Canary Wharf Collective, is trading unbelievably well. We actually ran it for, I think, 4 months as a favour to somebody. So we got some very, very good insight on that. Our own asset down in Guildford has been full. We filled it in 7 weeks.
Wow.
With a very limited marketing exercise. And the rental growth has been unbelievable, and we've got waiting lists for it. So I don't actually need, because I'm one of those people, I am one of those investors, I don't need to worry about the naysayers. In fact, I'm quite happy for them to be naysayers. Keep them out of the market and let me get on with it.
What's your strategy for the expansion of co-living across the UK and continuing globally?
So we've got 4 sites in planning in London at the moment. We're very keen to acquire elsewhere. I think, certainly let's deal with the UK first. So with nationally, okay, so there's been quite a number of units come through in Manchester. Key for proving a business case, because one of the interesting things we found is we offered, because of the planning restrictions, you can't offer less than 3 months in a sui generis planning consent. We would happily do a month, probably not a lot lower than that. But when everyone started moving in, they took 3 months. And I think the reason they took 3 months was because they wanted to see what it was like and whether it was as good as they thought it would be and what have you. Our average lease length there now, after 18 months, is 12 months. And we've got people who have renewed, I think they're on their 5th or their 6th renewal. So I think it's very much proven up there. So the reason I say that is it's going to be the same experience, I believe, in other regional towns. You'll have to persuade the planners that this isn't something that they don't want. We took both planning committee members and planning officers down to Guildford when we were doing all these other planning applications in London. They all came as naysayers and left as supporters. So I think but we are going to have to overcome that. So to roll out across the rest of the UK, I believe it's going to be quite hard work in terms of getting the planners there. So we have big aspirations. We believe the demand pool is at least as big, if not as big as students, but it's getting them out the door.
And Adam, who do you see as the kind of demographics for the co-living marketplace? Because I think a lot of people think that co-living is just student plus, but from our research, we see that there's 83-year-olds in buildings, there's young professionals, there's olders.
You've got my favourite fun fact. We have an 83-year-old in Guildford at the moment, and we had a 70-year-old couple in there.
Wow.
Where did you get the 83? Where did you get that number from?
Actually a resident in Folk in London, so maybe they're travelling around the UK.
Yeah, they might be doing a tour of the co-living buildings.
So weirdly enough, I don't know, but Scandinavia's got a little bit of a history of co-living, and it's based around the older generation providing support to the younger, such that the younger guys go out and do the shopping and what have you and help out for the more mature residents. And the more mature residents help out with a little bit of the childcare or looking after pets or what have you, because it's a slightly symbiotic relationship. And I wonder if there is a future iteration of that. I think in Scandinavia, it wasn't quite the studio accommodation, slightly more separate with more of your BTR type thing, but with more of a co-live type focus. So yeah, I personally think there is an angle for that. But in terms of where the demographic is, I think it's safe to say that probably 50% of our residents are under 35. The rest are they split down, and then when you're getting up to the more mature ages, it's very much in the minority. But there are what we call restarters, people who, for whatever reason, they've moved towns to get a different job. They may well be older. They may have got divorced and they just want an alternative way of life and find out what it's like. Then there's digital nomads who can be any age you like. So I think it's a significantly broader demographic than those who aren't involved with it say it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fantastic thing that Jamie touched on before about co-living is that you've got such a wide demographic and students can actually live there. So, if it's well positioned and that, especially in London, is such an undersupply, there is nothing to limit students also living in co-living buildings. I suppose from your perspective, having gone through everything you have to get to this point, and having built up such an incredibly successful and iconic brand within the industry, is there anything you would have done differently if you could start all over again?
Probably had more sites in planning at one time. No, so I think the one thing that I would suggest that I would do differently, and by extension is the advice I would give anyone else, is believe in your ability to deliver and keep it in-house. So even if you haven't got the expertise immediately available to you, you can hire somebody, but hire in-house so that the delivery of that expertise comes from the heart of the business rather than somebody else's perspective. That would be my one key take on it.
Brilliant. And I think I really loved what you said earlier about anyone can promise or market something, but actually the proof is in the delivery. And I think that comes through so much through your brand, is that promise, but integrity and delivery, which I think is so important for people starting out now who've got big dreams, starting small, proving yourself, proving the concept, getting a great product to market, have people come back to you with great feedback and build on that, and you can achieve big things.
Absolutely. It's important. It's important to develop a relationship and a reputation. And it's something that is well worth taking the time to curate. And it's something that if you get it right, it will open doors for you later on in life as well.
Definitely. So thank you so much for joining today. We are really grateful. And it was incredibly interesting to hear your personal journey, the future plans for Scape. And that's why we're really doing this podcast, is to give people that incredible insight into people that really have reinvented the industry as we know it and will continue to do so in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining today's Reinventing Real Estate podcast with Adam Brockley, one of the founders of Scape. Today, we really talked about all manner of activity, from how the student market is looking now, the future of the living sectors, and what we're seeing from a co-living perspective moving forward. So please subscribe on any podcasting channel that you're used to, and make sure that you follow us on our LinkedIn and any other social media channel as well. If you're interested in this type of content, make sure to check out all the other episodes and stay tuned for more content coming up very soon.